Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Friday the 17th of May. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined this evening by Martyn Day, the SNP MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. Martyn, thank you for taking time out at the start of your weekend to join us here this evening.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on again, Brian.
You're welcome. I'm guessing that you're in Scotland rather than in
I,
Westminster at the
I,
moment.
I am indeed. I am at home in my own living room, which is a lovely change from earlier in the week when I was down in the madhouse. So
Fair
it's
treat.
good to be back up, and not just back up, but back up with great weather. I've been out chapping doors today, and I've been wearing my Factor 50. It's been slapped on with a gallon load. So there's an investment tip for all the viewers: buy shares in suntan lotion companies because I'm going through it like nobody's business at the moment.
Yeah, I'm the same. I stick to the shady side of the street myself. So we might as well start. We better start the show, I suppose, with the
Yep.
Ukraine update. Today is day 814. Russia does not have sufficient forces on the ground to make a major breakthrough in Ukraine after launching its offensive in the Kharkiv region, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, Christopher Cavoli, said on Thursday. On Thursday, Ukraine said it was trying to stabilise the front line in the Kharkiv region. Moscow has seized 278 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory between the 9th and 15th of May, based on data from the Institute for the Study of War. It represents the largest territorial gain in a single operation since mid-December 2022. Russia's rapid advances in Kharkiv raise serious questions about Kyiv's ability to defend itself. Russia had telegraphed the operation in advance, and Ukraine was warned by Western intelligence, according to reports. However, military analysts stress there are explanations for why Ukraine has been forced back. It's suicidal for Ukraine to have its main line of defence on the border, where the Russians can hit you with artillery and glide bombs, and the Ukrainians don't have weapons available like HIMARS rockets artillery to hit back because of US restrictions, said George Barros, an analyst with the Institute for the Study of War. As a result, Russian forces were able to mass across the border in a relatively safe space, then mobilise into a lightly populated grey zone of Ukraine. Ukraine accused Russia of capturing and killing civilians in the border town of Vovchansk and of keeping about 35 to 40 people as human shields. According to Sergei Bolvanov, head of the Kharkiv region's police investigation department. President Zelensky met military leaders in Kharkiv city and said the situation in the Kharkiv region is generally under control and our soldiers are inflicting significant losses on the occupier. However, the area remains extremely difficult. We are reinforcing our units. The protracted air raid alert in most of Kharkiv region was lifted early today. The regional governor, Oleh Syniabov, said at least 5 drones struck Kharkiv. The public broadcaster Suspiln said an air raid alert had been in effect for more than 16 and a half hours in Kharkiv city, the longest recorded since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian attacks have destroyed one or more Russian warplanes and infrastructure at the Belbek airbase in occupied Crimea, according to reporting based on satellite imagery and other resources. The US has announced sanctions on 2 Russian individuals and 3 Russian companies for facilitating arms transfers between Russia and North Korea, including ballistic missiles for use against Ukraine. Kim Yo-jong, the powerful sister of the North Korean ruler Kim Jong-un, denied arms exchanges with Russia, state media KCNA reported. However, UN sanctions monitors have determined that debris from a missile that landed in Kharkiv was from a North Korean Hwasong-11 series ballistic missile. The International Monetary Fund will start a new Ukraine mission in coming weeks to assess its $15.6 billion loan programme and latest economic developments. The loan review mission also will revise the IMF's analysis of Ukraine's debt sustainability. Martin, that was quite a lengthy update there. Is there anything that you maybe would like to highlight?
I, I I don't think there's anything other than just how thoroughly depressing the whole situation is. I mean, this is several years now, and I have to say that Broadcasting Scotland gives one of the best, I think, accounts of what's happening in that whole conflict, because you so much of the mainstream media is just glossing over it now, which is sad. It's almost like this sort of fatigue with reporting the news unless something really massive happens. And the reality is there's just lots of misery going on all the time, and I don't see it coming to an end anytime soon. In fact, it's quite miraculous, I think, that the Ukrainians have managed to hold out as long against such a large opponent. They definitely need a bit more support, I think, in so many ways. But full marks to them, and yeah, let's just hope we get a peaceful resolution at some point.
Yeah. Thank you, Martyn. Yeah, it's quite depressing to sit here night after night and to be reading, Ukraine update 800, day 814. But
Yeah.
we do it because we think it's important. And then on to the latest from Israel and Gaza. At least 35,303 Palestinians have been killed and 79,261 have been injured in Gaza since the 7th of October, the Gaza Health Ministry said in a statement today. Staff at the Kuwaiti Specialty Hospital in Rafah said they fear a full-scale advance into the southern Gaza city by Israel would produce a crush of new patients that would overwhelm exhausted doctors who already complain of shortages of medicine and proper equipment. Israel must comply with international law in Gaza and address the devastating humanitarian crisis there, a group of Western nations wrote in a letter to the Israeli government seen by Reuters on Friday. All countries belonging to the G7, apart from the US, signed the letter, along with Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Finland. Israel has defended the military necessity of its Gaza offensive at the International Court of Justice after South Africa asked judges to order it to halt operations in Rafah and completely withdraw from the Palestinian territory. Israeli Justice Ministry official Gilad Noam called South Africa's case, which accuses Israel of violating the Genocide Convention, completely divorced from facts and circumstances. This week's hearings focused only on issuing emergency measures, and decisions on the request is expected next week. Hearings at the International Court of Justice were briefly interrupted today by a protester who called out liars as an Israeli official was presenting arguments. Israeli forces battled Hamas fighters in the narrow alleyways of Jabalia in northern Gaza today in some of the fiercest engagements since they returned to the area a week ago. Residents told Reuters that Israeli armour had thrust as far as the market at the heart of Jabalia, the largest of Gaza's 8 historic refugee camps, and that bulldozers were demolishing homes and shops in the path of the advance. The US military said trucks carrying humanitarian assistance had started moving ashore from a temporary pier in Gaza this morning. The US Central Command, CENTCOM, said no US troops went ashore in Gaza. Israeli settlers attacked and burned a truck in the occupied West Bank overnight on Thursday, injuring the driver. Spain has refused permission for a ship carrying arms to Israel to dock at a Spanish port, its Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares said on Thursday. Deir al-Balah is now unbearably crowded as Palestinians seek refuge from Rafah, said the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, today. In a social media post on X, UNRWA said more than 630,000 people had been forced to flee Rafah since Israel's military offensive on the area started on the 6th of May. It said that many Palestinians had sought refuge in Deir al-Balah, central Gaza Strip, and warned of dire conditions. Belgium's University of Ghent is severing ties with 3 Israeli educational or research institutions which it says no longer align with its human rights policy. The university's rector, Rick van der Waal, said in a statement that ties were being cut with Holon Institute of Technology, Migal Galilee Research Institute, and Volcani Centre, which carries out agricultural research. So again, Martyn, the same question to you there. Is there anything that strikes you from today's update on Gaza?
I mean, it's just the whole situation is a cure for optimism, isn't it? I mean, it's really depressing, and when you think that 14,500 children have been killed, the innocents are the ones that suffer the most in this, and of course, it's not going to, even if we. And I want to see an immediate ceasefire. We should end the armed sales. All of that it should be taken as a given. But even if we did that today, there would be tens of thousands more would die as a result of the malnutrition, the disease, the lack of medical facilities. The death scale is going to keep rising, even with the best will in the world now. It's thoroughly depressing.
Yeah. Thank you, Martyn. Yes, again, similar feelings when we read out what's been happening in Ukraine. But we carry on. So the next item is the First Minister has set out his ambitions for Scotland's economy in a speech in Glasgow this morning. Speaking at the Barclays campus in Glasgow's financial district, First Minister John Swinney outlined his government's approach to economic policy, making Mr Swinney said poor decision-making at UK level, typified by Brexit and immigration policy, means the Scottish Government must work even harder with its limited powers to help business and workers thrive. Apologies for my scan reading that. It didn't quite work. I'm so sorry if it's sort of left people wondering what I'm actually trying to say. The First Minister said he is determined to bring hope and optimism and will go all out to encourage economic investment. He said that policymaking will be governed by moderate left-of-centre progressive values, a partnership approach with unions and business, a focus on actions, problem-solving based on evidence. The First Minister highlighted significant announcements in Scotland's renewable energy sector this week and actions the Scottish Government is taking to boost high-growth businesses. The First Minister said, "My goal is to help people live happier and healthier lives with higher living standards and to help businesses boost profitability. The evidence shows that independent countries that are comparable to Scotland are wealthier and fairer than the UK. Scotland has the talents and resources to match that performance with independence, but in the here and now and in the face of Brexit, we must work even harder to help Scotland's economy with the powers we have." He went on to say, "I will go all out to encourage investment in Scotland, and I will ensure people know my government is a firmly pro-business administration. Partnership with trade unions and business will be at the core of my approach, and through that approach and given our resources, not least the incredible renewable energy, we should look to the future with hope and optimism." So, Martyn, I know that Kate Forbes has made similar statements that chime very much with the one that Mr Swinney's made today. To me, it kind of sounds like a standard party political press release. It sounds very familiar. And certainly the previous First Minister, Humza Yousaf, he said he was going to reset his government's relationship with business. So how is this different from what's been said before or what's new this time around?
Well, I think what's new is probably the emphasis, and I think as you know, I'm an SNP MP. I've been around the party for a very long time, and I think if you went back a number of years, we had an absolutely fantastic relationship with business during the time when Jim Mather was the business minister, and Jim's been retired a good number of years now, and I think it's fair to say that we've not been as well focused on our game there for a period. Now, I think a lot of good work was started under Nicola Sturgeon and then under Humza Yousaf, the work that they've had Ian Blackford doing as a business ambassador, using the talents across the wider movement, is we're seeing coming to a fruition. And I think the renewed focus on that John and Kate are now giving as head of the Scottish Government is really to be welcomed. And I say this as an old-fashioned left-winger. If we want a fairer society, the key to that has to be developing a stronger economy, because that's how you pay for the stuff that I want to see delivered on the doorstep. So it's essential, and I think the partnership approach with business businesses, trade unions, civic society, the colleges and universities working with government is exactly how we're going to achieve it. We need to do this as a national project for the whole nation, and it's good to hear that type of rhetoric and language being used. So, and I think if it's going to be delivered, I think John's exactly the guy to deliver it.
Thanks, Martyn. So, one of your colleagues the other day said that you had had a visit down in Westminster from Mr. Swinney, and appreciated that. I'm just wondering, since that visit, has Stephen Flynn, your leader in Westminster, sort of said, okay, let's change what we're doing or do something differently? I mean, is there anything different to your working day now?
Well, I should confess first up that I managed to miss the online visit from John. Business, as often happens in Westminster, changes. So I was in the chamber at the time, so I didn't get to hear. But I'm glad that he made such an early initiative to speak with the Westminster Group. And I think I've never seen the party at Westminster feeling so united and positive about a situation as I have in the recent couple of weeks. So it's very encouraging. I think we're firing on all cylinders and we're all fighting on the same side, which is what you want going into an election, a unified, united approach. And that's all very encouraging. So I think, yes, our approach at Westminster is probably unchanged. Our approach has always been to try and support the Scottish Government and defend it from the worst excesses of Westminsterism. They have to deal with the mitigating many policies rather than being able to deliver how we would like to deliver because we don't have the powers. Our job is front line to try and stop these things happening that need mitigated, or at least to make sure they're highlighted so that the public are aware of why things are being done to them, and encourage them to have the confidence to do things for themselves in the future, which is the whole core nationalist message.
Thanks, Martyn. You mentioned the upcoming election, general election. What's the latest gossip or rumours from Westminster about when that might be? Have you heard anything?
Well, caveat to be given at the beginning, my partner has asked me for months when can we book a holiday, and for months I said to her, oh, they'll do it in May, we'll get away in the summer. Well, as events have proven, it's not been in May, and it's going to be a lot later in the year. I think if I was putting a bet on at the bookies, and bear in mind I've already been wrong once on this one, but if I was putting a bet on now, my bet would be on the 14th of November. Being announced after the final conference speech, which Sunak will make as the last conference. So that's my current prediction. It could be a different time, but I think that's the logical process. And I've got a few perhaps cynical reasons for thinking that. First up, I believe the Tories make about £5 million at their party conference, so they'll want that to go ahead so they can bring in their corporate sponsorship. That corporate sponsorship is governed by different Electoral Commission rules and just straightforward donations to political parties, so it's less transparent, much more opaque, and I think they'll want a lot of that, shall we say, darker money to help fund their probably very negative culture war campaign. So I think they will wait, do that, let Sunak have his conference speech, and then come back and announce the election. And we're looking at probably the 14th of November. Another dark winter campaign, unfortunately for us.
Oh, okay. So we'll find out at some point, I guess. We'll
yeah, and if you do put a bet on, don't hold me responsible if he calls it at a different time.
Okay. No worries. Don't worry. I'm not a betting man, really. So the next item is the SNP's youth wing, Young Scots for Independence, or YSI, is holding its biggest ever international conference, with 60 YSI delegates from across Scotland, as well as almost 30 youth leaders from 7 progressive European political parties. Conference, under the heading of Our European Future, opened today in Stirling and concludes tomorrow with a keynote speech by Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson. The conference aims to expand the SNP's international connections, boost international support for Scottish independence, and for Scotland rejoining the EU after independence. It includes, It includes delegates from international youth parties such as the Social Democratic, Green and EFA groupings, parties traditionally aligned with the Labour Party. Over the 2 day event, delegates are taking part in panel discussions and workshops featuring senior parliamentarians, including Angus Robertson MSP, Neil Gray MSP, Colcab Stewart MSP, Alan Smith MP, and Amy Callaghan MP, and more. The conference is focused on how Scotland can play its full part in the world and how young people can contribute to that ambition right now and after independence. It will cover a wide range of issues from the cost of living crisis to the rise of authoritarianism and the far right in Europe to strengthening democracy and cooperation with Nordic nations. Commenting, the YSI's international officer and conference manager Olaf Stando said, forgive me, Scotland as a country and the SNP as a party are proudly internationalist, and this conference is testament to that. As the Westminster Government takes a narrow, inward-looking and increasingly extreme path, and Scotland continues to pay a heavy price for Brexit we never voted for, it's vital to raise Scotland's voice in Europe. So, Martyn, we heard from Olaf Stando there, one of the organisers, and he said youth leaders from 7 European political parties, from Social Democratic, Green and EFA groupings, are coming to Scotland to discuss Scotland's future and our shared values. He also said there's a huge amount of sympathy for Scotland in the EU, but it's up to us to harness it. I'm guessing that you're going to say you would agree with him when he says that.
Yeah, I would, and I think these initiatives are absolutely fantastic because there's two different dimensions to it. Of course, there's the international dimension, and the fact that our people are communicating with others across Europe and beyond across is to be welcomed because it does help shape international opinion. And one day, hopefully fairly soon, we will be looking for a body of international opinion to recognise an independent Scotland. So we want sympathetic ears. We want folk understanding what we're about and who we are, and youth leaders of today will be the adult leaders of tomorrow. So I mean, I think this is great at that level. And the other level is that we are fighting to win independence here in Scotland and reminding our fellow citizens, many of whom will have been no voters but wanted to stay in Europe, that we are the most European party that they have available, and that with independence we plan getting straight back into Europe as quickly as we can is a very key message in trying to bring that to reality. So I think it works on so many different dimensional levels, and it's great to see such a high caliber of people being involved and supporting it. I think it shows that it's been taken seriously, and it should be, and I think that's to be welcomed.
And that wide range of candidate delegates that are coming from all those different European political parties, which in the item said were usually aligned with Labour. Do you think the fact that they're now coming to an SNP event is of significance?
I don't think that surprises me. I mean, I've had international connections with people from other parties over since before I was an MP, indeed back to my council days, and many of them would be parties that would be left of centre, social democratic, etc. And they looked at us as fellow travellers in many respects, and were happy to meet and discuss. And once you've made connections, you tend to keep them. And I've been in touch with some of these individuals for I hate to say this, it makes me sound old, but for several decades now. And I think that is one of the legacy benefits that conference will bring to our current generation of younger people, because they will make contacts that will stand them in good stead, and they'll still be speaking to 20, 30 years from now.
Thanks, Martyn. I don't think I'm from the generation that this was targeted at either. So you and me both.
Yeah, it's undoubtedly easier now, I think, for the current generation because social media and digital communication techniques are there. Whereas in my day, when I met when I met people, it was when they physically came across on visits, and they would ask to see who they could meet, and we always tried to facilitate somebody meeting people, and some of these meetings have kept up. You could almost say lifelong connections now because some of them have gone back best part of 30 years. So I think great, yeah, more power to their elbow, and I think the guys running it have done a fantastic job.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And just to let viewers know that Broadcasting Scotland, we have somebody there today, and so we will be coming back at some point with a report from the conference.
Excellent.
So the next item is the SNP has said that continued austerity and a failure of the Westminster parties to seriously invest in economic growth will impose further financial and economic harm on the UK and ordinary households. The SNP were responding to a report from the National Infrastructure Commission which revealed that the UK government advisers had warned that a failure to go further, faster over the next 5 years on plans for infrastructure delivery could constrain economic growth and threaten climate targets. The SNP's economy spokesperson, Drew Hendry MP, said the Westminster parties must wake up to the reality of their great economic follies and reverse the planned £18 billion real terms cut to public services. Commenting, Drew Hendry MP said, "Over a decade of austerity has stripped back public finances, household incomes, allowed the cost of living crisis to wreak havoc, and left the UK in a grim economic position." He went on to say, excuse me, he went on to say this is the cost of cutting when what is needed is investment, but neither the Tories nor Labour, who have irresponsibly signed themselves up to the austerity regime, have failed to recognise or heed the warnings from experts, leading us down a path of more financial and economic harm. He went on to say, in order to reverse the damage done, both the Tory and Labour need to wake up to the reality of their economic follies, starting with reversing the planned £18 billion of real terms cut to public services. A failure to recognise that will set the UK back even further, something Scotland cannot afford. So, Martyn, a simple question to you. I mean, Drew Hendry, he's one of your colleagues, MP in Westminster. So I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to talk to him about this, and if you have, what do you think he would say if he was with us here in the studio now?
Well, I think you've just summarised exactly what we would say. I mean, we know from decades of Tory austerity that austerity isn't a good approach. It doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work if you're trying to stimulate growth. Being signed up to 18 billion of Tory austerity when the new Labour government comes in, and it will be a Labour government that comes in, is not going to benefit anybody. You know, I keep posing that question of, well, where's the change? You know, and we need to get them to think again on that whole austerity agenda. And 18 billion is a huge amount. Whatever problems our public services are facing just now, they're going to be a hell of a lot worse after another 18 billion of austerity comes their way. So, yeah, I am totally in agreement with what Drew has said. I suspect Drew and I will be saying much similar things next week when we're both serving on the UK Government's Finance Bill Committee. So at least we're on the same page, which nobody else in the room will be, of course. But there we go.
Yeah, and it seems to chime with what we've been hearing in FMQs in Edinburgh recently with both Douglas Ross and Anis Sarwar. Calling for money to be spent on things like more money on the NHS and the like. But the First Minister then replies and says, well, we've got a real terms budget cut, so how are we going to fund it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think we've got to keep reminding people that, you know, the Scottish Government has done remarkably well mitigating many of the worst excesses of the Westminster Government, but you can't keep mitigating what another government's doing, and you certainly can't keep doing that when they're cutting your budget that you were able to do some of that with. So despite that, we've managed to, you know, maintain significant funding in health, for example, one of the key drivers. But if Labour follow the Tory proposals for continuing privatisation in the English health service, then that will by default cut the public spending on health, which will cut the Barnett consequentials that we get, which will then put us in an even more difficult position over the term of the next government. So that's something we need to be very alert to, and we need to be shouting from the rooftops that, you know, that's a line they must not cross. Unfortunately, I suspect they will get a massive majority and they will cross that line.
Okay, thank you, Martyn. So the next item is... Sorry.
I was going to say thoroughly depressing, isn't it? We're managing to do all the depressing stuff tonight.
Yeah, it's a good way to start the weekend, isn't it? You know,
so it can only get better from here. You know,
we'll see how the show ends. So, oil and gas workers risk becoming the coal miners of our generation. Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham has warned, urging Labour not to ban new North Sea licences without a clear plan to safeguard jobs. Unite is launching a billboard campaign in 6 Scottish constituencies aimed at persuading Sir Keir Starmer to commit more investment to North East Scotland, the centre of the offshore oil and gas industry. Unite, which was Labour's biggest donor in the 2019 general election, wants to see more specific pledges of investment in green technologies in the North East Scotland. Graham said Unite research suggested that £6 billion over 6 years would be needed to kickstart wind turbine manufacture in the region. The SNP has warned the future of the North East is under threat after a new report confirmed that Sir Keir Starmer's plans for the region would lead to 100,000 Scottish jobs being axed. The report, commissioned by investment bank Stifel, warned that the accelerated decline scenario being championed by Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party could lead to £20 billion lower capital investment in the North Sea by 2035 and 100,000 jobs being axed by as early as 2029. The SNP's Westminster leader and MP for Aberdeen South, Stephen Flynn, has warned that Sir Keir Starmer's plans will have devastating consequences for the region and that, just like the Tories, Labour are content selling out the north east of Scotland in order to fill the pockets of the UK Treasury. So, Martyn, I think I'm right in saying that this featured quite highly last night on BBC Question Time. Anna Sarwar said something along the lines of only Labour could provide a just transition from the oil and gas to renewables, and then both Stephen Flynn and Alex Salmond did a pincer movement on him, and both of them are quick to point out that if Labour follows through on its plans to extend the windfall tax to 78% and to cut investment allowances, then tens of thousands of jobs in the oil and gas would be lost, and that would be before the transition to renewables would come in. So who was right? Is it Sarwar or Flynn and Salmond?
Well, I'm obviously clearly biased. I didn't see the show last night, but Stephen Flynn is all over this issue. He knows it inside out, and I would take his word on that one over Anna Sarwar's any day of the week. I think the end reality that we have to consider is that these are Scottish jobs, Scottish resources, and unless we're independent, it will be other people that are making the decisions for us. And it comes down to who's going to make the best decisions. Clearly, our people know the situation better, and we would undoubtedly make better decisions in the interest of ourselves. So we should be, using it as a tool to help advance the independence cause, because we can do far better using these resources for ourselves and protecting the jobs and getting the green investment. And at the moment, I don't think Westminster is remotely interested. It's tokenism, and we really risk the green jobs going elsewhere in the world, if we don't get a grip on this.
Okay, thank you, Martyn. Yeah, it was unusual, I think, to see two pro-independence people on the same panel on BBC Question Time in Aberdeen last night. But and Stephen Flynn, pretty much, as you can imagine, got interrupted throughout. So maybe you could put a word in his ear and let him know that if he wants to come on here, then he won't face really any serious interruptions at all.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure many of my colleagues will be listening, and if not, I will let them know when I see them next week.
Okay, thanks, Martyn. So the Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething is facing fresh turmoil after Plaid Cymru ended its cooperation agreement with the Labour-led government in Wales. Rhun ap Iorwerth, the Plaid leader, said he was deeply concerned that Gething had refused to hand back a £200,000 donation for his successful leadership campaign from a company whose owner was convicted of environmental crimes. The cooperation agreement, under which Labour and Plaid worked together, was due to conclude at the end of the year, but today ap Iorwerth announced it would end immediately. The decision will make it harder for the government to operate as it does not have an overall majority in the Senate. Ap Iorwerth also expressed concern that Gething this week sacked a minister after the leaking of an embarrassing phone message from the time of the pandemic when Gething was the Welsh Health Minister. Rhun ap Iorwerth said, "I remain deeply concerned that the First Minister has failed to pay back the £200,000 donation to his leadership campaign and believe it demonstrates a significant lack of judgment. Money left over has now been passed on to Keir Starmer's Labour Party." The issue has blighted the first 2 months of Gething's leadership, and on Thursday he came under more pressure after sacking the Minister for Social Partnership, Hannah Blythen. The dismissal followed the leaking of an exchange with fellow Labour members from the time of the pandemic, when Gething said he was going to delete iMessages. Gething has said the messages were not about government business, but related to internal discussions within the Senate Labour group. Blythen has denied leaking them. The cooperation agreement has resulted in policies such as providing free school meals for all primary school pupils, taking radical action to address the housing crisis, and taking steps to safeguard the Welsh language. Beorworth said, "I am proud of the way in which the agreement demonstrated a new way of doing politics which focused on areas of policy which impact people's everyday lives." So, Martyn, we've been lucky here on Broadcasting Scotland to frequently have a Welsh guest, Hugh Marshall. I don't know if you've been able to catch any of his contributions.
Yeah, I've been. I'm sure I've been on shows with Hugh as well. Yes.
Yes, in fact, you're right. And I think I might even have hosted one of them. So thanks for prompting me about that. But Hugh's often been critical. In fact, I did probably on that very show, very critical right from the start of Mr. Gething's. He wasn't pleased when Gething became First Minister even. Again, you're at Westminster, an MP. Does this get talked about much in Westminster circles?
It does. Obviously, we speak with our Plaid colleagues on a fairly regular basis. In fact, most days of the week when we're in London, we will often have lunch together in the tea room, and we'll share notes as to what we think is happening business-wise. So it is a subject that I've heard about, and I hadn't realised until you'd made the report there that it has now already been passed to Starmer's Labour Party, the remaining funds, which is the bulk of it, is what I understand. We knew that was something that would have to happen, and therefore it means this Welsh problem has now become a UK Labour problem, because what will they do with these funds? And these aren't just minor environmental breaches that this firm has done. They're two pretty serious ones, and I believe on one occasion an employee was actually killed, was what I'd heard. So there's certainly questions to be asked about the source of the funds, and should it have been kept? No, it shouldn't have been, in my opinion. So that's now a headache that they've got, and I think Plaid have been quite correct to distance themselves on that basis. It's a different regime than the one that they were working with Mark Drakeford. In terms of Welsh business, the reality is Labour's, I think, one seat short of a majority, so they will be able to manage that, I'm sure, much the same as we are managing in the Scottish Parliament, just short of a majority, because there's multiple parties there with different views. It just means there needs to be a bit more dialogue and a bit more of consensus to get business through, and that often isn't a bad thing. And so I think that partnership arrangement came to its natural conclusion, and now there's a clear dividing line that's there, and a different headache for the UK Labour Party as a result of their actions of their Welsh colleagues.
Thanks, Martyn. And I think there's a fair chance that we're probably going to be contacting Hugh at some point before the full Scottish on Sunday. But if he's able to join us, then it'd be interesting to hear what he has to say about it.
Yeah.
So, new rules intended to reduce the use of antibiotics in farming in England have been criticised as too lax and weaker than their equivalent under EU laws. The updated regulations, which came into force today, ban the routine use of antibiotics on farm animals, and specifically their use to compensate for poor hygiene, inadequate animal husbandry or poor farm management practices. Experts have warned that there are loopholes in the legislation that are closed off under EU laws in place since 2022, and by which the UK would be bound if it were still a member state. The UK government ministers repeatedly promised, before and after Brexit, that farming and food standards in the UK would not be watered down after leaving the EU. However, there are numerous examples of environmental rules that have been weakened in England, from regulations on air pollution and water quality to pesticide use and agricultural emissions. The latest divergence is of particular concern because the overuse of antibiotics in farming has dire consequences for human health. Earlier this week, Former Chief Medical Officer in England, Sally Davies, said that antibiotic overuse was leading to the rise of near invincible superbugs that pose a severe threat to human life, making previously minor ailments deadly and threatening to make routine operations unsafe. About two-thirds of antibiotics globally are used on farm animals, and they are often used indiscriminately, either to promote growth or to try to prevent infections that arise from overcrowding, poor management, and insanitary conditions on factory farms. Under the UK government's new rules, it will still be possible to feed antibiotics prophylactically to large groups of animals in England, a practice campaigners say is effectively the same as and just as dangerous as routine use. The guidelines say this prophylaxis should be in exceptional circumstances, but questions in Parliament by the Shadow Minister, Daniel Zeigner, elicited a response from the Farming Minister, Mark Spencer, that this would include where there would be a risk of infection or severe consequences if antibiotics were not applied. Colin Noonan, a scientist advisor at the Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics, said this meant widespread prophylactic use on large groups of animals would still occur frequently, because when animals are kept in highly intensive conditions, there's often significant risk of infection. EU rules ban antibiotics for group prophylaxis, limiting it to an individual animal only. In Scotland, farming is devolved, and the Scottish Government have a stated intention to try to keep regulations in Scotland in line with the EU. Martyn, I suppose that's the main concern here. Agriculture, forestry and fisheries is devolved to Holyrood. Antibiotics are used in Scottish salmon farms, for example. And what we're wondering, how is this going to affect Scottish farmers if agriculture is devolved and an SNP government in Holyrood wants to stay in alignment to EU laws as much as possible? This is going to make it much more difficult, isn't it?
It could do. I have to confess, I don't know enough on this issue to really make much of a comment. I don't know quite how it applies in Scotland, if it does or doesn't. But irrespective of whether it does or doesn't, the reality is this is a serious risk that will come from its use in England. And antimicrobial resistance is a global problem, not a local one. And, whatever happens there will have a knock-on effect on ourselves. So all of that is to be, greatly concerning. It's one of these examples, I suppose, that anyone that listened to the Brexit debates and thought that leaving the EU was about improving our standards, buttoned up the back way. I think because the reality is it was always going to be on the cards that we would have a race to the bottom once we'd left, and I think we're starting to see that with some of the evidence. So yeah, quite concerning, but the sooner we get ourselves back into Europe and comply with better level of standards, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Martyn. I mean, we were trying to grapple with this before we came on here as well, and trying to work out where it applies. Is it only England or is it the whole of the UK? So we think it's the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill, which is going through Westminster just now, and we think it's part of that. Oh, it's already through, I'm told. And then the UK Parliament, just for information, the UK Parliament does sometimes make laws for Scotland about things that have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament. That usually does this only after the Scottish Parliament has given its agreement through a legislative consent motion or an LCM. And MSPs debate those and vote on those LCMs to give their view. We tried to have a look to see if we could find an LCM about this. But
Yeah, I
couldn't
mean,
really.
there's a whole range of pieces of legislation, some of which obviously do get legislative consent. There was also an awful lot of post-European adjustments made to a mountain of British legislation at all levels. So it may have came through some of that as well. And the UK Internal Market Act's another factor in there that would see us having to comply with ministerial strokes of the pen on stuff. Some of the use of Henry VIII powers to get stuff rushed through when they were up against the wire on the periods and timescales that they had to get the legislation changed in, and so it could be any number of those. I would need to look into that, but it's certainly a worrying development. I mean, the global use of antibiotics is too excessive, and we've got to take a stand on that internationally. And for us to have any credibility in trying to discourage others from unnecessarily using them, we really cannot be in the position of using them willy-nilly ourselves unless it is essential. So yeah, not a great position.
Yeah, and we also tried to contact Jim Fairley, MSP, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity, before we came on air to see if he could maybe help us out to understand this better. But obviously, it's easier said than done on a Friday evening after working hours. So, yeah. So,
Well, it's not. It's an issue that won't be going away anytime soon, and I'm sure Jim's insight on it would be very useful for us all to hear. I'd certainly be keen to hear that myself.
yes. So, if you're listening, Mr. Fairley, give us a shout. So the next item is the number of UK bank branches that have shut their doors for good over the last 9 years will pass 6,000 today, and by the end of the year, the pace of closures may leave 33 parliamentary constituencies, including 2 in London, without a single branch. The tally is being published by the consumer group Which, as it seeks to make the avalanche of closures and the disastrous impact they can have on local communities an election battleground. 8 more Barclays branches are due to close on today, taking the total to 6,005 since 2015, when Which began counting. Barclays is the bank accused of closing the most branches. Its decommissioned outlets are said to make up about 20%, that's 1,216 of the total. The rate of closures hit a peak in 2017, but had appeared to slow before what the consumer group describes as a troubling surge in recent months. It accuses banks of seemingly engaging in a race to close branches after the government announced plans in 2020 for laws to protect access to cash that would potentially make it more difficult to shut a branch if alternative provision was lacking. Fresh rounds of closures are being announced every few weeks, with banks justifying the reduction of their networks on the grounds that customers are spurning traditional counter services in favour of banking online and via mobile phones. There have already been 200 closures scheduled for the rest of 2024, including 50 from NatWest, 43 from Lloyds, 28 from TSB, 26 from Halifax, 20 from Royal Bank of Scotland and 14 from Barclays. The number of lost branches is equal to 60% of the national network in place 9 years ago. While millions of consumers have made the switch to banking digitally, there remain significant numbers not yet ready or willing to make that leap who need accessible alternatives. With a general election taking place in the coming months, Which said the next government should commit to delivering at least 200 banking hubs in the first 2 years following the election. Banking hubs operate in a similar way to a standard branch, with a counter service run by post office staff where customers of almost any bank can withdraw and deposit cash, make bill payments and carry out regular transactions. So Martyn, I fit into that demographic. I don't do online banking or use banking apps. I'm guessing, it sounds like to me like this could be a subject that should be able to gain cross-party support. So, are there any
Yeah.
discussions? Yeah, have you had any?
Oh,
I know that. Sorry.
yeah. All pretty much all the time. This has been an ongoing issue for us as MPs since we were elected, because I don't think there's been a year gone by where we haven't had a number of bank branch closures across the country, and certainly even within my own constituency. We're just seeing one with the Royal Bank's last remaining branch in my constituency about to close in Bathgate. So every area is affected by this. In the last week, I presented a petition on my branch closure in Parliament. I know Deirdre Brock led a debate in Westminster Hall on the issue of bank branch closure. So it's in there, it's getting discussed. But of course, the reality is what actually can we do to affect a change? And part of this is down to the policy of the banks. Now, I should confess, in full transparency, I used to be in banking. It was over 25 years since I escaped, as it were, into the world of politics and local government and now Parliament. But I mean, even going back to my time in banking, banks were almost pushing customers out of branches. They were, if you wanted cash, they'd rather you went and used the cash machine. If you were wanting different services, you phone up and use the telephone banking, and it was everything was driving customers away. And that's a pace that's increased massively since digital bankings came on. And for many people, digital banking is more convenient. I use it, and I kind of like it. But then I'm of an age where I'm comfortable with that. There's a lot of people who don't use it through choice, or are not, digitally literate enough to use it, or don't have the internet access, or there's barriers. So for a significant minority of our population, digital banking isn't part of their answer, and these people seriously risk being left behind in terms of financial services, and that is a major problem for people in our communities, and that's across every community.
What about Witch's suggestion about banking hubs where no matter which bank you belong to, you could go in and do some transactions? Does that sound like a goer?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things are all to be welcomed where they can be delivered. But I mean, if you look around, my constituency has the largest electorate in Scotland. It's a mix of towns and villages. Wherever you put something of that nature, unless an individual has access to transport, it's difficult for them to avail themselves of it. There is no real substitute for the loss of these branch banking networks. Now, the reality is the world has changed, so there's a need for fewer bank branches. I just worry that we've gone too far in that direction, and people are seriously at risk of being left behind financially, particularly if they're in more isolated communities. So you link that with lack of internet or with other factors in there, and really they're a major disadvantage. And that's not just individuals, that also will affect businesses as well. And if you've got a business that's cash dependent, then suddenly you've got another problem for how you deposit your cash, and that can be massive journeys to deal with that. So it's lots of issues there that are impacting on our constituents.
Thank you, Martin. So today, French police shot dead a man armed with a knife and an iron bar who set fire to a synagogue in the Normandy city of Rouen earlier today. The Interior Minister, Gerald Darmanin, travelling to visit the fire-damaged synagogue, said France was deeply affected by what he called an anti-Semitic act. He said the government was extremely determined to continue to fully protect Jewish people in France, wherever they are, and Jews should practice their religion without fear. Emergency services were alerted at 6:45 a.m. after a fire was detected at the synagogue in the city, 130 kilometres northwest of Paris. The man was spotted on the synagogue roof, brandishing an iron bar and a kitchen knife, the prosecutor handling the case said. Smoke was coming out of one window at the synagogue, the Rouen prosecutor, Frédéric Tillet, told reporters. The attacker jumped off the roof and ran towards one police officer, shouting abuse and threatening him with a knife. The police officer warned him to stop, but he continued. The officer then shot him 5 times, hitting him 4 times, Tillet said. The man died at the scene. Nicolas Meyer-Rossignol, the mayor of Rouen, said there was extensive damage to the synagogue, but no one else was harmed. He said an armed man somehow climbed up the synagogue and threw an object, a sort of Molotov cocktail, into the main praying room. Firefighters arrived at the scene and the blaze was brought under control. 2 investigations have been opened, one into the fire and a second into the circumstances of the death of the attacker. So, Martin, I don't know if there's very much that we can say about this because we don't know that much about it, just beyond the sad fact that there's been a loss of life. I don't know. I mean, when I hear these kinds of stories, I wonder about that person's mental health issues. But I then also wonder, did that person have to be killed? Couldn't he just have been maimed, and then we could have maybe tried to find out why he did it?
I mean, I'm coming quite new to this story. I basically know what you've just read out there because that's the extent of my knowledge. And I suppose there's a number of points that jump to my mind, and this is me completely busking without any detailed knowledge of what actually has happened. First up, I think right across the world, really, we're seeing a rise in both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents. I've no doubt that the tensions in the Middle East and various protests and counter-protests are perhaps adding to that. That's a concern that we need to try and help dial down, these temperatures and make sure the communities can cooperate and work together, as most people have the same values and the same desires in life. So let's, just get on with each other a bit better. We've no idea, knowing what's motivated this individual. It would be, speculation to guess at. Often is the case, as we hear, that mental health is a factor in these type of incidents. Time will tell what the motivation was, perhaps, if we can work it out. And I suppose the nature of the police response, without being there and seeing the incident, again, we'd just be guessing. But 5 rounds of ammunition being fired into someone does seem a bit much, when perhaps other less lethal methods could be there. But perhaps the officer didn't have a less lethal method at his disposal. So, again, we'll have to wait and hear what the actual inquiry into that tells us. So, just very depressing when anyone's life is lost, irrespective of the circumstances, and quite upsetting for a wider community when damage and fear comes into the factor as well. So, yeah, it's definitely been a depressing night to be on the show tonight, isn't it? So, can I put a request in for some positive news stories the next time I'm on?
We'll do our best. We do often try to finish on a good news story, and certainly a good news story for Scotland. But sadly, Martyn, I don't think it's going to happen tonight. But it's certainly good. It's not because you're the guest. We didn't do this on purpose, I promise. But the last item of the evening is the first national volunteer survey of litter found by Scottish rivers and waterways has revealed that plastic bottles were the most littered item, followed by plastic pieces, plastic snack packets, drinks cans and polystyrene pieces. With 80% of marine litter coming from land, With 80% of marine litter coming from land, environmental charity Keep Scotland Beautiful's Upstream Battle campaign focuses on raising awareness, gathering evidence and inspiring action to change littering behaviour to prevent marine litter at source along rivers in Scotland. The recently published Upstream Battle Citizen Science Report, a snapshot of data gathered by volunteers across a 3-month period between December 2023 and February 2024, consists of 185 surveys conducted along 26 rivers and waterways in 20 local authority areas across Scotland. It forms part of the national rollout of the campaign aimed at understanding and addressing marine litter across the country. In total, 20,383 items were counted during the survey period, with the majority of litter found to be items which would be addressed under a deposit return scheme, the DRS, or effective extended producer responsibility, or EPR regulations. The rest of the top 10 items littered includes cigarettes, glass fragments, dog poo, plastic bottle caps and plastic bags. Barry Fisher, Chief Executive at Keep Scotland Beautiful, said, on the back of an extremely successful spring clean, this report celebrates the efforts of many individuals and groups who took time out of their busy lives to carry out surveys and send data to us, providing us with much needed evidence of the range of limits that are damaging our rivers and waterways. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, Martyn, but 2 things struck me. One is, as the item said, the deposit return scheme was meant to tackle littering of this type, wasn't it? Plastic bottles, but we've been denied that. And also in Scotland, I think I'm right in saying that the use of single-use plastics has been banned, but it looks like maybe there's more needs to be done.
Yeah, I think there is more that needs to be done. This, doesn't let us off the hook, but this is very much a global phenomenon. It seems to be worldwide, so we really do need to be tackling this. And I often wonder how much of it could be reduced at source. There is often unnecessary plastic packaging. That's only one part of it, because we do need things to be packaged in a way that's safe as well for keeping the products. So what do we do with the bits that we get? And there needs to be a lot more done on plastic recycling. I think there's so much plastic already being created that a lot of it could be recycled, be that chemically or otherwise, and we're not really at the races on that part. But of course, that's assuming we've got the rubbish in a sensible position to begin with. And if it's littering our rivers and our countryside, then there's an attitudinal issue here where we need to take litter home with us, make sure we put it in the right bins, and that we can do something with it. And that's perhaps sometimes easier said than done. And I'm not letting anybody off the hook here. I mean, if I came up from London last week on the sleeper, and I went to get myself something to eat before I got the train, and I ate it out in the wee bench outside Euston Station, and there's no bins. No bins anywhere I could find in the station. I ended up bringing that litter home with me and sticking it in my bin in Linlithgow. But a lot of folk would just have tossed it somewhere. So, we need to make sure that we're giving people adequate bins to get rid of stuff, and to do the recycling and the segregation that makes that more viable.
Thank you, Martin. And talking about bins, it's well, there are bins. Certainly, I would say after 14 years of austerity and Scotland's budget's being cut, it's like we also need to have workers so that they're going round. There's enough refuse collectors going round to make sure that bins are empty and not overflowing, as we often see in cities. But yeah, I'm just sorry that we couldn't have ended on a more upbeat story for you this evening.
Well, at least that's an issue that every one of us can try and do something to improve by not dropping litter, not letting it fly out of our hands or wherever. So we can all take action on this one to make an improvement, and it's incumbent on each of us to do that wee bit more to make it better.
Yes, and again, just before we do go, but one of the things that really annoys me is when I see bottles of plastic bottles that are still full of ginger or still full of water, and they're lying on the pavement,
or whatever. I sometimes dread to think what might be in some of them. Yeah,
and people just seem to think that water's just they don't see it as a resource, I suppose, like oil or something like that. But so maybe on that note, I better let you go and start your weekend and try and find somebody to cheer yourself up.
Well, it's still a lovely night, so I'm going to head off for a wee casual walk and go around and see my parents for a wee bit of time. So let's hope they don't depress me tonight.
Okay. I hope we haven't scared you away from next time either. But thank you.
No. Any time I'm available, I'm more than happy to jump on.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. Well, that's it for this evening, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend very much on the generosity of you, our supporters. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our focus now moves on to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. But once again, thank you to Martyn Day. Thank you. And
thank you.
Thank you. And goodbye, and thank you for watching.